The world had grown eerily quiet after the apocalypse. Cities were in ruins, and forests once filled with life now stood silent, barren. The undead roamed the earth like a forgotten plague, and humanity had almost disappeared. Yet, among the chaos and despair, a glimmer of hope was born. A group of survivors, small but determined, had found a place to take shelter, a dilapidated farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It was their sanctuary, their temporary haven in a world gone dark. But even this place, isolated from the horrors of the world, could not shield them from the gnawing feeling of impending doom. Supplies were running low, the food scarce, and they knew they couldn't stay here forever. Riley, a former cartographer, was among them. He had been the one to find the old farmhouse. His background in map-making had made him valuable, as his skill with maps was one of the few things that hadn't been lost in the collapse of society. It was Riley who first uncovered the map, tucked away in an old leather-bound case inside the farmhouse. The map was faded, edges frayed, but unmistakably marked with a single word that had become a lifeline: safe haven. The map had been drawn long before the outbreak, a relic from a time when civilization was thriving. It depicted a location deep in the mountains, far from the city, a place that was supposedly untouched by the zombie plague. It was a sliver of hope, a promise of safety in a world where survival had become a daily battle. But there was something about this map that unnerved Riley. He couldn't shake the feeling that the journey it promised would be anything but easy. The mountains it pointed to were dangerous, filled with threats both living and undead. Yet, it was their only chance. Riley gathered the others in the dimly lit room. His fingers traced the faded ink on the map as he spoke. "Listen, I know this might sound insane, but I believe this map could lead us to safety. If we follow it, we might just find a place where we can rebuild, where we can live without constantly fearing for our lives." Lena, a fierce and pragmatic survivor, crossed her arms as she listened. She had seen too much in the past few months to be easily convinced. "And what makes you think this map is even real? It could be a trap, a dead end." Riley paused, glancing down at the map. The uncertainty in Lena's voice was valid. It wasn't like there were many trustworthy maps left. After the outbreak, most of the remaining survivors had become scavengers, taking whatever they could to survive, even if it meant creating false hopes to lead others into danger. "I don't know," Riley admitted. "But it's our best shot. We don't have any other options." The group fell silent. Each survivor had their own reasons for staying alive, their own demons to fight. They had lost family, friends, and their homes. The world they had known was gone. Now, all they had was each other, and the hope that somewhere, there was still a place for them to call home. Max, the youngest of the group, broke the silence. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that silenced the others. "I want to go." His eyes were wide with fear and determination. Max had grown up after the outbreak, never knowing a world without the undead. But the idea of a place where the quiet still existed, where life could flourish again, was something that called to him. Riley looked at Max, then at the others. "We'll leave at first light," he said, his voice steady. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we begin our journey." As the group prepared for the trek, Riley couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The map could be a lie, or it could be the key to everything they had lost. But there was one thing he knew for certain: the journey would change them all. That night, the farmhouse was quieter than usual. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as if warning them of the danger that lay beyond the walls. But within, there was a sense of anticipation, a strange calm before the storm. Everyone knew that the road ahead would be treacherous. Zombies lurked in the shadows, their groans carried on the wind. The quiet that had settled over the world wasn't just a sign of peace, it was a harbinger of something much darker. Riley sat by the window, staring out into the dark expanse. The map lay on the table before him, its faded lines and markings casting a shadow over his thoughts. He wasn't sure what they would find at the end of the journey, but one thing was clear: this was no longer about just survival. It was about hope, and in a world where hope was in short supply, that was the most dangerous thing of all. Tomorrow, they would set out on the longest journey of their lives. The quiet was over. the true test was just beginning. The sun barely kissed the horizon as the group prepared to leave the farmhouse. The air was thick with uncertainty, and though their backpacks were packed with the last of their food and supplies, it was the map that everyone carried, clutched tightly, yet delicately in their hands, that felt heavier than anything else. Riley led the way, his gaze fixed ahead, determined not to show any signs of hesitation. Behind him, Lena checked her weapons, an old but well-maintained shotgun and a hunting knife that had seen better days. She kept her distance from the others, her sharp eyes scanning the surrounding woods, ever watchful. Max, the youngest of the group, clung to his sister, Claire, who had become his protector since the death of their parents. Her presence was a calming force for him, though even she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. They moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the woods as much as possible. The landscape around them was a haunting reminder of the world that had been. Fallen trees blocked the once vibrant roads, and the remnants of abandoned vehicles, rusted and decaying, were all that remained of a time when life had seemed simpler. The air smelled faintly of decay, a sickening mix of old earth and death that never seemed to dissipate. Riley kept his eyes on the map, using the distant landmarks to navigate. The mountains ahead were still far away, but he could feel the weight of the journey pressing down on them already. The survivors had walked for hours, barely speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. "How far is it, Riley?" Lena asked, her voice breaking the silence. "How do we know we're even heading in the right direction?" Riley glanced up at her, trying to read her face. There was skepticism in her eyes, the same skepticism that had first risen when he showed them the map. But there was something else there now, a quiet resolve. She wasn't questioning the journey anymore, she was just worried. "We're on track," Riley said, though his voice wavered slightly. "The map says it's another day's walk to get to the base of the mountain. We'll camp out tonight, then head up tomorrow morning." They continued, the forest slowly opening into a rocky, more desolate terrain. The deeper they ventured, the less they saw of the world that had been. There were fewer signs of life, no animals, no birds, no sounds of civilization. It was as if the earth itself had given up. But Riley knew that this was the only way. If the map was real, they would be close to the one place that could offer them something better than mere survival. As the day wore on, a thick fog began to roll in, turning the already muted landscape into a ghostly vision. It was a strange thing, quiet, unnerving, but the group pressed on, not knowing that something darker was already watching them. Around midday, they stopped to rest by a small creek. Riley took the opportunity to study the map again. He had always been a man of logic, of reason, and it felt strange for him to rely on something so uncertain, so fragile. The map, despite its age, felt like the only thing tethering him to the idea of hope. But deep down, he knew the dangers weren't just physical. It wasn't the zombies they had to fear, it was the world itself, the unspoken terror that lurked in the spaces between every safe haven, every journey. Max, who had been quiet up until now, approached Riley, pulling at his sleeve. "Do you really think we'll make it, Riley? To the safe place?" Riley paused, looking down at the boy. The innocence in his voice was a stark reminder of what was at stake. "I don't know, Max. But we have to try. It's the only chance we've got." Lena overheard, and though her face remained impassive, her eyes softened as she watched Max and Riley. She didn't often let her guard down, but there was something about this little family, about the bonds they had formed, that made her wish for something more than the constant battle to survive. She wanted peace. Even if it was just for a moment. Suddenly, Claire's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Riley, look out!" It was too late. From the edge of the fog, a low growl echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of undead feet. In an instant, the air turned cold, the atmosphere heavy with danger. Lena moved instinctively, raising her shotgun and scanning the fog. The first zombie stumbled into view, its eyes glazed over, a grotesque expression frozen on its face. Then another appeared. And another. The horde had found them. "Run!" Riley shouted, grabbing Max's hand and pulling him away from the creek. "Move! Now!" The group scattered, each survivor sprinting in a different direction. The fog had created a wall of obscurity, blurring the line between safety and terror. In the midst of the panic, Riley's heart raced, and he fought to keep his bearings. They couldn't afford to be overwhelmed by the horde. They had to keep moving, no matter what. Lena fired at the approaching zombies, the deafening sound of gunfire echoing in the empty forest, but it did little to stop the onslaught. They were relentless, closing in on the survivors. "Get to the rocks!" Riley yelled, pointing toward a nearby cliffside where the terrain became steep and jagged. It was their only chance to gain higher ground and get away from the zombies. The group sprinted toward the rocks, their legs burning, adrenaline pumping through their veins. But they could feel the horde on their heels, relentless in its pursuit. As they reached the base of the cliff, Riley turned around, his breath ragged. The fog had thickened even further, and he couldn't see where the others had gone. But there was no time to look back. The journey had only just begun, and already, they were fighting for their lives. The rocky cliffside was their only refuge, but even there, they found no peace. As the group scrambled up the craggy rocks, their hearts pounded in their chests, the threat of the undead never far behind. The zombies, though slow, were relentless, and their growls echoed through the fog, chilling the survivors to the bone. Riley was the last to reach the top, pulling Max up with a firm grip. His fingers were raw from the climb, but there was no time to focus on the pain. The sound of groaning and shuffling was growing louder, and the fog seemed to thicken with each passing second. The air felt suffocating, thick with dread. Lena was already at the top, scanning the area with her shotgun ready. Claire and Max were next, both struggling to catch their breath as they collapsed onto the rocky ground. Their small group had barely made it to safety, but only just. The zombies were still out there, closing in on the base of the cliff. "We need to make sure they can't climb," Lena said, her voice low and urgent. She wiped the sweat from her brow, eyes darting to the fog below. "We'll be trapped if they find a way up." Riley nodded, his gaze fixed on the growing number of undead below. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The sun was setting, and with it, the last light of the day. The night would bring even more dangers, more uncertainty. "We'll need to find shelter for the night," Riley said, his voice steady but tinged with an underlying unease. "We can't move through this fog at night, and we can't stay exposed up here." Lena set her jaw, her eyes scanning the terrain. "There's a cave up ahead, just a little ways from here. It's small, but it should be enough to give us some cover." The group nodded in unison, and they quickly began to move, slipping past jagged rocks and stumbling over the uneven terrain. Each step was careful, deliberate. Every sound, every movement, felt amplified in the quiet. Even the rustle of leaves underfoot seemed to echo through the night air. When they finally reached the cave, it was as Lena had described, small, but it would work. It was nestled into the side of the mountain, half hidden by a thicket of trees. The entrance was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but it was deep enough to offer some protection. The survivors crowded into the cave, their bodies pressing against the cold stone walls. The flickering light of a small fire was the only warmth they could offer each other. Riley sat closest to the entrance, his eyes never leaving the fog outside. Lena took up a position further inside the cave, her gun still in hand, though she hadn't fired it in hours. Max and Claire huddled together near the fire, their exhaustion clear in their tired eyes. The silence in the cave was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Riley's mind raced, replaying the events of the day, the zombies, the climb, the desperation of it all. He could still hear the growls of the undead, lingering in the fog outside. It felt like they were being hunted, even now. And yet, the worst part of it all was the uncertainty. The map, their only hope, was still out there, but so was the horde. How long would they last? Riley turned to the others, trying to hide the doubt in his expression. "We can't stay here for long," he said, his voice quiet. "The fog's still thick. We'll need to move before they find this place." Lena didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the fire, lost in thought. Then, finally, she spoke. "We need to be smart. If we move out in the morning, we can reach the foothills by midday. From there, it's a straight shot to the base of the mountains. But we need to make sure we're ready. Riley knew she was right. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. Every second they wasted, the danger grew. The undead weren't the only threat. They had to worry about the terrain, the elements, and the unknown dangers lurking in the fog. But the map, the hope of reaching that safe haven, kept him going. Max suddenly spoke, his voice barely audible. What if it's not real? The map, I mean. Riley turned to him, surprised by the question. He had expected Max to be more hopeful, more trusting, but the boy was just as scared as the rest of them. I don't know, Max, Riley replied, his voice soft. But we have to believe in something. Without that, there's nothing left to fight for. There was a long pause, and for a moment, the cave was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Then, Max spoke again, his voice trembling slightly. Will we make it? Riley hesitated, looking at the faces around him. The uncertainty in the air was thick, but he couldn't show it. Not now. Not when they needed him the most. We'll make it, he said firmly, though the words felt hollow, even to him. We have to. The night grew colder, and the shadows in the cave seemed to stretch endlessly. Outside, the fog pressed in like a living thing, swallowing the world whole. The sounds of the undead, distant but ever-present, were a reminder of how close danger was. As they settled in for the night, each survivor found their place in the dark, trying to rest despite the fear that gripped them. Riley lay awake, staring into the blackness, his mind racing. Tomorrow would be another day of the journey, but it would also be another day of survival. He had led them this far, but the road ahead was only getting more dangerous. The last map that could save them all was still out there, but so were the monsters. And Riley knew that time was running out. The morning light struggled to pierce through the dense fog that had settled in overnight. It was a dim, ghostly light, barely enough to make out the outlines of the rocks and trees surrounding their cave. But to the survivors, it was enough. They had to move before the fog thickened again and the zombies came back for round 2. Riley stood first, stretching his stiff limbs and silently cursing the cold that had seeped into his bones during the night. The fire had long since burned out, and the chill of the mountain air had taken its toll. He looked at the others. Max and Claire were still huddled close together, their eyes red and swollen from the stress of the previous day. Lena, ever the pragmatist, was already packing up their small supply stash, checking their weapons with careful precision. Her face was set in a grim expression, but there was something in her gaze, a resolve that Riley had come to rely on. We move in 10 minutes, Riley said, his voice low but firm. Lena nodded without a word. She was always ready to move, always prepared for whatever came next. But there was something different today. Something had shifted in the air overnight, as though the fog was not just hiding the landscape, but hiding the danger too. Riley had always believed that they could make it to the safe haven. The map, the promise of safety, it had kept him going. But as the group stood at the cave entrance, looking out at the fog that swallowed the world whole, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something worse than they had anticipated. Max, looking tired and small against the vast landscape, tugged at his sister's sleeve. "Do you think it's really out there?" he asked in a whisper, his voice carrying a thread of fear. Claire gave him a soft smile, though her eyes betrayed her own uncertainty. "I don't know, Max. But we have to keep going. It's the only chance we have." She took his hand, and together they stepped out of the cave, joining Riley and Lena. As they began their trek through the fog, the oppressive silence weighed on them. The fog wasn't just a weather phenomenon, it felt like a wall, isolating them from the world, turning everything into a distorted version of itself. Lena led the way, eyes sharp, scanning every shadow, every movement. She had seen what zombies could do, how quickly they could tear apart a group that wasn't paying attention. And the fog only made them more dangerous. They could be surrounded before anyone even heard a sound. The terrain was increasingly difficult to navigate. The ground was soft and uneven, and the once innocent-looking rocks were now jagged and treacherous. Riley's eyes kept darting back to the map, trying to align its features with the land around them. The safe haven was still a long way off, and they needed to be careful with each step. Every wrong move could lead them into a horde or worse, into a trap. But something else gnawed at Riley's thoughts. The further they went, the more it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The air was still, the trees motionless, as if nature itself had gone silent in fear of the coming storm. It was too quiet. Hours passed without incident, and though they were on edge, they hadn't seen a single zombie. Riley felt uneasy. There were signs of their presence everywhere, scraps of torn clothing, bloody handprints on rocks, but no actual undead. It didn't make sense. He had learned not to trust too much quiet. It always meant something worse was lurking around the corner. "Something's wrong," Riley murmured to Lena, catching up to her as they paused for a brief rest. "This silence, it doesn't feel right." Lena looked around, her eyes narrowing. "It's too quiet." "I know. It's almost like the zombies are waiting for us. Or something else is." Before Riley could respond, Claire's voice interrupted from a few paces ahead. "Look! Over there." She pointed to the left, where the fog began to swirl in an unnatural pattern. The air around them seemed to bend, distorting the view of the trees and rocks ahead. Riley's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just the fog, it was as if something was moving within it, shifting, a shape that wasn't quite right. Lena's hand went instinctively to her shotgun. "Stay close," she warned. "Something's out there." Riley didn't need to be told twice. The uneasy feeling in his stomach twisted into a knot as they moved toward the swirling fog. The further they got, the stranger it became. The fog seemed to pulse, almost alive, as though it were responding to their presence. And then they heard it. A distant, guttural growl, not from a zombie, but something deeper, darker. It was a low, rumbling sound that made Riley's heart stop. "What was that?" Max asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Riley replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But we need to get moving. Now." They turned and began to retreat, but the fog behind them shifted, and something emerged from the mist. A shape, tall, twisted, and moving with an unnatural grace. The figure wasn't a zombie, not quite. It was something far worse. It stood there, watching them, its eyes glowing faintly through the fog. The air around it rippled with an almost otherworldly energy. For a moment, the survivors froze, as though the very air had turned to stone. Then the figure moved, its gait predatory, slow, deliberate. Riley's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen many horrors since the outbreak, but nothing like this. Whatever that thing was, it was not human. It was something darker. "Run!" Riley shouted. Lena didn't hesitate. She pulled Max and Claire to their feet, urging them forward. The group scrambled through the fog, the eerie figure pursuing them at a slow but relentless pace. Riley's pulse raced as he glanced over his shoulder, barely seeing the thing in the fog, but he knew it was getting closer. The mountain pass that had once seemed like salvation now felt like a trap. And the shadows in the fog were closing in. The fog clung to their skin like damp cloth, every breath thick and heavy in their lungs. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't let up. It followed them, just out of sight, its presence pressing down on them like an invisible weight. Riley kept pushing forward, adrenaline surging through him, the sound of his pounding heart the only thing he could hear above the eerie, distant growl of the creature in the mist. "Keep moving," he shouted, his voice strained. "Don't look back." Lena had already taken charge, leading the group toward the narrow ravine ahead, where the path veered sharply to the left. They had no choice but to head for the cover of the canyon walls. It was their only chance. Max and Claire stumbled behind, exhaustion written across their faces, but they pushed on, fear giving them the strength to keep going. Riley's mind raced. If that thing in the fog caught them, it wouldn't just be a normal threat. It felt different. More intelligent, almost. Something older, more predatory. The path grew steeper as they descended into the ravine, the sharp rocks cutting at their boots. It was a tight squeeze, but it was their only option. The fog seemed to dissipate somewhat here, but they still felt the creature's eyes on them, as if it were circling. "I don't like this," Lena muttered as they made their way through the narrow passage. "We're getting boxed in." Riley glanced over his shoulder, but saw nothing but shifting white. The low growl was getting closer again, the sound of it vibrating through the air. He hated how it made him feel, trapped, vulnerable. "We need to find a way to lose it," Riley said, his eyes scanning the walls of the ravine. The stones seemed to shimmer faintly in the fog. They needed to move fast. Just ahead, a faint glimmer caught his eye, a break in the rock, almost like a hidden cave entrance. It was small, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. Without thinking, Riley motioned for the others to follow him and dashed toward the opening. "Over here," he urged. "Quick!" The group scrambled toward the cave, squeezing into the small space one by one. Max and Claire were the last to enter, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they pulled themselves into the tight, dark space. Inside, it was cool and quiet, the only sounds their heavy breathing echoing off the stone. Riley could hear the faint sounds of the creature's growls outside, but they were muffled by the walls of the ravine. The fog, too, seemed to hold its breath. "Do you think it saw us?" Max whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Riley replied, eyes fixed on the cave entrance. "But we need to stay quiet." Lena moved to the far side of the cave, her eyes scanning the rocks around them. She motioned for the others to huddle in the center, away from the entrance. "The map," Lena said suddenly. Her tone was sharp, focused. "We need to study it. We're not going to survive this unless we know where we're going." Riley pulled the crumpled map from his backpack, spreading it out across the ground. His hands trembled slightly as he traced their route. The fog, the creature, everything was beginning to blur together. They needed to focus. "This path leads us through the foothills to the base of the mountains," Riley said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "We're still a couple of days away from the safe haven." Lena leaned in closer, her fingers tracing the path. "If we follow this route, we can make it, but it's going to be harder with whatever's out there in the fog. We don't know what it is, but we need to stay ahead of it." Riley nodded. "I know. But we need to stick together. No one gets left behind." They sat in the cave, the silence stretching between them, broken only by the occasional soft scrape of rocks shifting or the distant growl outside. The hours seemed to crawl by, the tension thickening in the confined space. "I keep thinking about what Max said earlier," Claire spoke up, breaking the silence. "What if it's all a lie? What if the safe haven isn't real?" The doubt in her voice stung, though Riley understood. The world they knew was gone, replaced by chaos and fear. But they had to keep believing. They had to. "The map is our best shot," Riley said, his voice quieter now. "If it's real, then there's hope. We just have to hold on." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure. The creature in the fog, whatever it was, seemed to have a purpose, and that made him uneasy. Zombies were predictable. The undead were a constant, mindless force. But this thing was different. It was intelligent, it seemed, and it had found them. It was as if they were being hunted. Lena's voice broke through his thoughts. "We should move when it's dark. It's too risky to stay here much longer." Riley agreed. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. But as night fell, the fog grew heavier, swirling around the cave entrance like an impenetrable wall. They had to leave. But the creature, whatever it was still out there. And it knew they were nearby. They needed to move. But how? The growls outside grew louder again, and Riley felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was no escaping the fog, and the creature that followed them wasn't just going to let them slip away. The question remained, how could they survive the night and get to the safe haven before it was too late? Nightfall settled heavily on the ravine, the dense fog now hanging like a suffocating blanket over the landscape. The cave had been their temporary refuge, but the outside world was a different story. Riley could feel the presence of the creature just beyond the walls of the cave. Its growls had grown more erratic, almost desperate, as if it was sensing them, waiting for them to make their next move. They couldn't stay here much longer. The air in the cave was thick with tension, and the longer they remained, the more vulnerable they became. Riley glanced around at the others, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear, their eyes wide with uncertainty. But they had no choice. The map, their only hope of survival, was still in his hands, and they had to keep moving forward. "We wait until it's darker," Lena whispered, breaking the silence. Her voice was tight, strained, but there was a determination behind it. She was always the first to act, the first to make decisions when the stakes were high. Riley appreciated that, even if the weight of leadership was slowly wearing on her. Riley nodded, his eyes scanning the cave entrance. "We move fast once we do. We stay in formation, no one breaks off." "Right," Claire said, her voice barely audible, but Riley could see the steel in her eyes. Despite the fear, there was something else there. Something resilient. She had changed since the beginning of this nightmare. Max, ever the silent one, clutched his sister's hand tightly. His small body trembled, but he didn't speak. He understood more than Riley had given him credit for, but fear still held him tightly in its grip. As the hours dragged on, the group huddled together, the crackle of their whispers the only sound breaking the eerie stillness. Every now and then, the growl outside would flare up, too close, sending a shiver through them all. The creature wasn't just searching, they were being hunted. Riley's thoughts churned. There had to be a reason why that thing was so persistent. It wasn't like the zombies they had encountered. Those were mindless. No strategy. No cunning. But this thing, whatever it was methodical. It had a plan. And if they didn't figure it out, they were as good as dead. "How do we lose it?" Riley muttered aloud, his eyes narrowed. Lena's voice was steady. "We don't. We have to confront it." Riley stiffened, looking at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "We have no choice. The map doesn't lie. We have to keep moving east if we want to reach the safe haven. But it's clear that creature knows the path too. If we don't take it head-on, we're never going to make it out of here." Her words struck a chord in him, but they also made his stomach turn. Confronting whatever that thing was felt like a death sentence, but Lena was right. They were out of options. The creature was closing in, and their chances of slipping by were growing slimmer by the minute. "I'll take point," Lena said, her hand reaching for the axe strapped to her back. "Riley, you cover the rear. Claire, you and Max stay in the center. Don't look back." Riley was about to protest, but he saw the look in her eyes, unwavering, determined. She wasn't asking. She was telling them. And as much as he hated it, he knew she was right. The fog was thick, but they had no choice but to move. With one last glance at the trembling Max and Claire, Riley took a deep breath, signaling for the others to follow. As they stepped out of the cave and into the suffocating fog, Riley's heart hammered in his chest. The cold seemed to have seeped into his very bones, but he pushed through it. They had no time to waste. The ravine was narrow and treacherous, the walls scraping against their sides as they picked their way through the mist. Each step felt like a 1,000-pound weight pressing down on him, the silence pressing in from all sides. And then the growl sounded again, closer this time, sharper, filled with rage. "Keep moving," Riley ordered quietly, his voice tight. Lena led the charge, her axe held firmly in her hands, her eyes scanning the swirling fog ahead. Riley followed closely behind, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, heart pounding in his ears. Claire was keeping Max close, her hand tightly gripping his. The young boy's wide eyes searched the fog, and Riley could see the terror written across his face. They pushed through the ravine, hoping that the darkness would work in their favor. But the thing was still there. They could feel it, its presence lurking just out of sight. The growl came again, closer this time. Then, a sudden movement caught Riley's eye. Something flashed through the fog, faster than any zombie should be able to move. It was sleek, too quick, too agile. "Lena!" Riley shouted, but it was too late. From the darkness, the creature emerged, its form taking shape out of the mist. It was taller than a man, its body covered in tattered remnants of what might have once been clothing. Its face was a horrific, twisted mockery of humanity, half decayed but with a twisted, unsettling intelligence gleaming in its eyes. It wasn't just an animal. It wasn't just a zombie. It was something more. Before they could react, the creature lunged at Lena, moving with inhuman speed. She swung her axe, the blade slicing through the air, but it was too late. The thing dodged effortlessly, its movements fluid, predatory. Riley's heart skipped a beat. No! Lena was knocked to the ground with a brutal force, the creature's grotesque fingers digging into her armor. Riley rushed forward, pulling his gun from its holster, but his hand shook with fear and uncertainty. "Get back!" Lena screamed, struggling against the creature's grip. Without thinking, Riley fired a shot, hitting the creature in the shoulder. It snarled, rearing back in a blur of motion, but then it came again, faster than before. They were out of time. Riley took a deep breath, his instincts kicking in. "Claire! Max!" he yelled. "Move, now!" He ran toward the creature, ignoring the overwhelming fear that threatened to paralyze him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about getting Lena back. And he wasn't going to let the creature take her, or anyone else, without a fight. The air felt thick with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the kind of cold that came from fear, from the stark realization that death wasn't just a possibility, it was an inevitability. The creature, faster and more lethal than anything they had encountered, was in front of them now, and every moment spent fighting it was a moment they didn't have. Lena's cry echoed through the ravine as the creature's jagged teeth scraped across her armor. She was strong, but even she couldn't hold out forever under the creature's relentless attack. Riley's hands were trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he couldn't afford to let fear take hold. He had to act. "Claire, Max, keep moving!" Riley shouted, his voice hoarse, but full of urgency. Claire looked torn, frozen for a moment as she held Max's trembling hand. The young boy's wide, frightened eyes locked onto the scene before them. He was shaking, his body stiff with terror. "Go!" Riley barked again, his voice cutting through the fog. He didn't have time to explain, and he couldn't afford for them to be caught in the crossfire. Max let out a strangled whimper, but Claire pulled him forward, dragging him along as they continued down the ravine. They didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. Riley had no choice but to focus on Lena, who was now struggling desperately to push the creature off her. Its claws tore at her armor, ripping through the fabric, but she was still fighting. Riley raised his gun and fired another round, but this time, the creature didn't flinch. It seemed impervious to the bullets. Lena gritted her teeth, using every ounce of strength to shove the creature away, but it was like fighting a wall of muscle and fury. It recoiled for just a second, but it wasn't enough. It was fast, too fast for any human to outmaneuver. It lunged again, and this time, Riley saw the sharp glint of its teeth as it bore down on her. Without thinking, Riley hurled himself at the creature, grabbing it by the shoulder and pulling it off Lena. The force of the impact knocked him to the ground, the creature twisting in his grip. "Lena," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the creature's guttural snarl. It was like nothing Riley had ever heard before, deep, resonating, with a touch of intelligence in it, as though it understood exactly what it was doing. Lena scrambled to her feet, blood dripping from a gash along her side, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. "Riley, get out of here," she yelled. "It's not worth it." But Riley wasn't going anywhere. Not now. He shoved the creature back again, but it was like pushing against a stone wall. His chest heaved with exertion, his muscles aching as he tried to hold the creature back. It was strong, impossibly so. But then he saw it. Just for a second, as the creature lunged at him again, he noticed something on its shoulder, something faint, almost glowing in the darkness. The same kind of marking that had been on the map. A symbol, intricate and strange. "Lena," he gasped, his eyes wide in realization. It's marked. The map, it's connected to them. Lena didn't hesitate. Without wasting a moment, she grabbed the map from Riley's hand, the edges crinkling in the tension of the moment. She studied it for only a heartbeat before nodding grimly. There's something about this place, about the symbol. It's tied to the creature, maybe to all of them. Her voice was low, urgent. We can't just fight it. We need to get to the center of the mist. There's something there that can help us. Riley didn't argue. He understood now. It wasn't just about getting away. It was about finding what lay at the heart of the fog. And if they could reach that, maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to stop this nightmare. The creature lunged again, faster than before. Riley barely dodged the strike, its claws grazing his arm. His vision blurred from the pain, but there was no time to dwell on it. He grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her toward the direction they'd been heading. We need to move. Now. But the creature was relentless. It circled them, its eyes glowing with a predatory gleam. It wasn't just hunting them, it was cornering them, forcing them deeper into the ravine. Lena and Riley exchanged a glance. It was clear they were running out of time. The only chance they had was to make a break for the center of the fog, where the map had indicated something important. With a burst of adrenaline, they sprinted toward the narrow path that led upward, toward the fog's epicenter, hoping that the map wasn't leading them to their doom. The creature followed, too close behind them for comfort. Its growls grew louder, echoing in the thick mist, until they seemed to reverberate in every direction. Riley pushed on, his breath ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced back at Lena, who was barely keeping up. They couldn't afford to slow down. Every moment spent running felt like a life stolen from them. But then, the mist began to thin. The walls of the ravine opened up, and for a moment, Riley thought they had escaped. But then he saw it. A glowing structure in the distance, ancient, weathered, and half buried in the ground. Its surface shimmered faintly, as if alive. It was a relic of something old, something ancient, and it was their only hope. But the creature was closing in fast. The air around them seemed to vibrate with tension as it prepared for its final strike. Keep running! Riley shouted, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. We're almost there. But as they neared the structure, the creature's form lurched toward them one final time. And then, just as the creature was about to strike, everything went dark. The ground beneath them gave way, and the world seemed to collapse. There was nothing but the rush of wind and the suffocating darkness as they fell into the depths below. The fall was endless, the world around them spinning and twisting as if time itself had fractured. Riley's stomach lurched, his mind struggling to make sense of the sudden plunge into darkness. The cold air hit him hard, but it was the silence that terrified him the most. For a moment, he thought they had all died, that the creature's final strike had taken them to the grave. But then he felt the ground, rough and uneven, beneath him. He wasn't dead, yet. His head throbbed, his vision blurry as he pushed himself up. The others were scattered around him, some groaning, others completely still. Lena's form was closest, her face pale from the fall but still breathing. Riley rushed to her side, checking her pulse with frantic fingers. She was alive, but barely. Her wounds, from the creature's claws, were deep, and there was blood on her lips. Lena! Lena, wake up, Riley whispered, shaking her gently. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering before her hazy gaze locked onto him. Riley, where are we? She murmured, her voice weak. We fell. But you're safe, for now. Lena's eyes scanned their surroundings. They were in a cave, no, not just a cave. The walls shimmered with an unnatural light, as if the very rocks themselves were alive. The air was thick, charged with energy, like the calm before a storm. It was the same eerie glow they had seen earlier, the one that had been on the creature's shoulder. This place, it felt ancient, filled with secrets buried long ago. This is it, Lena whispered, her voice trembling with awe. We found it. The heart of the mist. Riley nodded, his mind racing. The creature had been chasing them for what felt like an eternity, and now they were in the center of whatever this place was. The fog, the markings, the strange structure, it was all connected. But what did it mean? Max was the next to stir, his small frame crumpled on the ground. Claire was by his side immediately, checking for any injuries. Riley gave them a nod of reassurance, though his own heart was still racing. They were here, in this strange place, but they weren't alone. The creature hadn't followed them into the cave, at least not yet. They had a moment, perhaps their only moment, to figure out what the hell was going on. But even as they gathered their bearings, Riley could feel it. The tension, the pressure of something massive, unseen, watching them. "We need to figure out what this place is," Lena said, struggling to her feet. She winced as she took a step, but her resolve was unbroken. "It's the only way we're getting out of here alive." Riley stood, brushing the dirt from his clothes, his gaze fixed on the shimmering walls. The map had led them here, to the very center of the mist. But it wasn't just the map that had brought them. It was something else. Something they couldn't yet understand. "Look," Claire said, her voice tight. Riley turned to see her pointing at the far end of the cavern. The glow seemed to be coming from a narrow passage, almost hidden in the shadows. "Could be the way out," Riley muttered, motioning for the others to follow. "Let's see where it leads." But as they began to move, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A low rumble reverberated through the air, and the mist outside seemed to shift, growing heavier, pressing in on them from every direction. It was like the entire world was moving, reacting to their presence. Riley felt a surge of dread, a sense of finality hanging in the air. "We're not alone," Lena said, her voice tense, her hand gripping the axe as if it might protect her from whatever came next. "Something's coming." Riley's eyes flicked to the entrance of the cave, and sure enough, there it was. A dark figure, moving in the distance. Too fast, too precise. The creature. But it wasn't just one. There were others. The cavern was alive with motion now, shadows shifting as if the walls themselves were alive. Riley's heart pounded in his chest. They hadn't escaped. They hadn't found safety. The creature they had fled from, the one that had nearly killed Lena, was only the first. The map had led them here, and they were about to discover the true horror of the place they had entered. "Riley," Lena's voice trailed off as she looked at the oncoming figures. What are they?" The creatures were emerging from the walls themselves, twisted shapes, their bodies contorting as if they were both part of the cave and something else entirely. It was as if the mist, the structure, and the creatures were all connected, one living, breathing entity. "They're not zombies," Riley said, his voice tight with fear. These are something else." The figures were moving toward them, their eyes glowing, their bodies shifting with unnatural speed. Riley didn't hesitate. He grabbed the gun, his grip tight, and aimed at the first figure. He fired, the shot echoing through the cavern, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it twisted its body, impossibly fast, and launched toward them with a scream that shook the walls. "Get ready!" Riley shouted. The group scattered, Lena and Claire taking position to defend the rear while Riley and Max rushed toward the narrow passage. But the creatures were everywhere now, filling the space, moving in ways that defied all logic. It was chaos. It was madness. Riley turned to Lena. "We need to get through that passage, now. It's our only chance." With a quick nod, Lena ran beside him, the others close behind. The creatures were closing in, but they weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to understand. They were fighting for the answers hidden in the heart of the mist, in the very place that had been designed to keep them, and everything else, locked away. Riley didn't know what awaited them beyond the passage. But one thing was certain, the map had been right about one thing. This place wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a prison. And now, they were all trapped inside. As they reached the passage, the final creature lunged at them, but they were faster, slipping into the narrow corridor just as the monster crashed against the wall. The air was thick with fear, and Riley's mind raced with the only thought that mattered now. Survival.